So the student was referred to the student assistance team, interventions were done, and the student didn't progress with any of the Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions. A read was completed and it was determined that no new assessments or evaluations were needed. The MET team reviewed all of the current data and completed the MET form to determine eligibility for a student with a learning disability. The student met the criteria, an IEP was scheduled, and the IEP team is going to meet to review the information and determine if the student needs special education or related services, and if so, what placement will make it possible for the student to progress. In the IEP process, we have to consider that it's become too form-driven and not student need-driven. We need to look at the IEP process through a different lens. Remember that the IEP process is a student-centered team process requiring data-based decision-making, alignment to the curriculum that ensures educational benefit and complies with federal regulatory standards. So this is not just another meeting. The IEP team makes critical decisions that can have long-term significant consequences for the parents, the school district, and especially the student. The team meets to review the draft IEP and then work to develop a final plan that will describe the student's special ed programs and/or services, and the whole process is dictated by regulations. So the federal regulations that look at the process they have a definition of the individual education program, tells who the IEP team members are, parent participation, and alternative means of meeting participation. So first we're going to look at the IEP team. So the public agency must ensure that the IEP team for each child with a disability includes the parents of the child, not less than one regular education teacher of the child, if the child is or may be participating in the regular ed environment, not less than one special education teacher of the child, or where appropriate, not less than one special education provider of the child, a representative of the public agency who is qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of children with disabilities, is knowledgeable about the general ed curriculum, and is knowledgeable about the availability of resources of the public agency. So let's look at that individual. Most of the time, that representative of the public agency is an administrator because they are qualified. They oversee the provision of special ed services. They hire the special ed teachers and determine what kind of programs are going to happen in the district. They are knowledgeable about the general ed curriculum, and they're knowledgeable about the availability of resources of the public agency. What rooms do they have available? What financial resources the district has? So they make that determination. Can the district provide an aid? Can they get computer services for the student? Those kinds of pieces. The special education teacher does not have the authority to make that final decision. So a representative of the public agency, usually an administrator, occasionally they assign someone. Sometimes they give the school counselor that authority. It just depends. Or the special education director in the district. It just depends who the district wants to provide that authority to. That person must be at the IEP meeting. The next member, an individual who can interpret the instructional implications of evaluation results, who may be a member of the team. So probably a MET team member who can come in and talk about what evaluations and assessments were done. And at the discretion of the parent or the agency, other individuals who have knowledge or special expertise regarding the child, including related services personnel as appropriate. So the parents could bring in somebody from the U of M who has assessed the student for autism or for some other physical disability. So that's at the discretion of the parents. They can be invited. They can request them to come. and whenever appropriate, the child with a disability. If it's a transition IEP, in accordance with the paragraphs of this section, the public agency must invite a child with a disability to attend, and if the purpose of the meeting will be the consideration of post-secondary goals for the child, and the transition services needed to assist the child. If the child doesn't attend, then the public agency has to take steps to ensure that the child's preferences and interests are considered. Also, if it's a transition IEP, if they're going to invite somebody from like Goodwill or Michigan Rehab, the parent has to be notified of that and give consent for that person to attend. So, we need a parent of the child, not less than one regular ed teacher of the child, if the child is going to be participating in the general ed classroom, not less than one special education teacher of the child, a representative of the public agency, an individual who can interpret any instructional implications or evaluation results that were done if they were done. If this is not an initial and no testing was done, that person isn't a required member. And at the discretion of the parent or the agency, any other individuals who may need to be there to provide information to make the best decision, and whenever appropriate, the child. For those members that are required, there is an attendance issue. So, a member of the IEP team, described in paragraphs A2 through A5 of that section, is not required to attend an IEP in whole or in part if the parent of a child with a disability and the public agency agree in writing that the attendance of the member is not necessary because the member's area of the curriculum or related services is not being modified or discussed in the meeting. So if they're talking about one particular part of the IEP and say that the student has speech therapy, but that is not an issue that's being discussed, the speech therapist doesn't necessarily have to come, but the parent and the district have to excuse them in writing. A member of the IEP team described in paragraph E1 of this section may be excused from attending an IEP team meeting in whole or in part when the meeting does involve a modification to or discussion of the member's area of the curriculum or related services, if the parent in writing and the public agency consent to the excusal, and if the member submits in writing to the parent and the IEP team input into the development of the IEP prior to the meeting. So say one of the members, say the speech therapist cannot attend because they're going to be out of town. The parent has to be alerted of that fact ahead of time, and then they have to agree, and the district has to agree in writing that it's okay, as long as the member also provides the parent and the district information about their piece of the IEP in writing and some discussion about the importance of the goals and the objectives possibly that the student's going to do, as well as progress monitoring. So members can be excused, but there's a process for it. So we're looking now at parent participation. Public agency responsibility. Each public agency must take steps to ensure that one or both of the parents of a child with a disability are present at each IEP team meeting or are afforded the opportunity to participate, including notifying parents of the meeting early enough to ensure that they will have an opportunity to attend, and scheduling the meeting at a mutually agreed on time and place. So that means you have to let the parent know. You can't call the night before and say, oh hey, we have an IEP meeting at 8 a.m. So you have to give the parent notice. There is no time requirement written in the regulations, but 2 weeks is usually best practice. If you give them about 2 weeks, most of them can get some time off work if it's necessary. You also have to schedule the meeting at an agreed on time and place. So if the parent can't be there at 8 o'clock because they're going to get docked pay, you're going to have to be a little flexible and possibly meet them at 4 p.m. after they get off work. Information has to be provided to the parents. The notice required under paragraph A1 of this section must indicate the purpose, time, and location of the meeting and who will be in attendance. The parent has to know that ahead of time, and that's done in the invitation that we're going to talk about later. You have to inform the parents of any provisions and relating to the participation of individuals on the IEP team who have knowledge or expertise about the child relating to the participation of Part C. For a child with a disability beginning not later than the first IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16 or younger, if determined appropriate by the IEP team, the notice must indicate the purpose of the meeting, if you're going to talk about post-secondary goals for transition, and if you're going to invite any agency people. If neither parent can attend an IEP team meeting, the public agency must use other methods to ensure that parent participation, including individual or conference telephone calls, consistent with 300-328, related to alternative means of meeting. So you can use Skype, you could use Google Hangout, you could use FaceTime, you can have the parents send an email, you can use the speakerphone, whatever you need to do to get them to be there. If a parent cannot attend, a meeting may be conducted without a parent in attendance if the public agency is unable to convince the parents that they should attend. In this case, the public agency must keep a record of its attempts to arrange a mutually agreed on time and place, such as detailed records of telephone calls made or attempted and the results of those calls, copies of correspondence sent to the parents and any responses that are received, and detailed records of visits made to the parent's home or place of employment and the results of those visits. You have to have interpreters. The public agency must take whatever action is necessary to ensure that the parent understands the proceedings of the IEP team meeting, including arranging for an interpreter for parents with deafness or whose native language is other than English. And the public agency must give the parent a copy of the child's IEP at no cost to the parent. And that's whether the parent is at the meeting or not at the meeting. So alternative means of meeting participation. We talked a little bit about that. You have to be able to get the parent there, and if that means they can't attend in person, you find some other way to meet with the parent. And the regulation just states, when conducting IEP team meetings and placement meetings pursuant to this subpart and subpart E, and carrying out administrative matters, the parent of a child with a disability in a public agency may agree to use alternative means of meeting participation, such as video conferences and conference calls. So think out of the box sometimes. Sometimes you may have to come up with some alternative way to get the parent to be there. So we've looked at some of the regulatory parameters for the process. So let's look at the different purposes of an IEP meeting, because remember, you have to inform the parent of the purpose of the meeting. It's important in planning to understand the purpose. That will help you prepare and gather the necessary information. So there are different meetings, and in order for the team to function, the purpose needs to be established. Everyone needs to know what's happening. There's an initial IEP meeting, an annual review IEP meeting, reevaluation meetings, graduation and aging out meetings, changing placement or adding services, manifestation determination IEP meetings, functional behavior assessment meetings, requested IEP meetings, and the changing placement or adding service IEP meeting that's listed here can be an addendum, an amendment, so we'll talk about that. So an initial IEP meeting, the focus is to determine a student's eligibility for special ed and develop an IEP that describes the programs and services that will be provided, and to gain parent consent for initial implementation of the IEP. At an initial IEP, when a team determines that a student is a student with a disability, the student receives entitlements and protections that follow them throughout the whole time they have an IEP. They're entitled to a free appropriate public education. They have some discipline protections that general ed students don't have, and we'll talk about that in the discipline section. And they have harassment and discrimination protections based on their disability. The annual review meeting, the focus of the meeting, the team reviews data to determine if the student has made progress and has received educational benefit or not. The team determines if the student has or has not made progress. If the student has made progress and achieved educational benefit from the current IEP, like supplementary aid services, transition activities, goals and objectives, and programs and services, that the program has met the legal standards to be considered appropriate. The team uses the current information to help determine the next appropriate supplementary aids and services, transition activities, goals and objectives, and programs and services that the student will be working through. The team determines the student has not made progress or achieved educational benefit from the current program. Then the team must determine what changes are needed to enable the student to have educational benefit. The team may need to have additional assessment information to make decisions on how they need to adjust the IEP. Also remember that an annual review meeting has to be done within 365 days of the last meeting. It has to be all completed, signed, ready to implement. The offer of a free appropriate public education has to be made within 365 days of the previous IEP. So you have to keep that in mind when you're scheduling the annual review meeting. The focus of the reeval meeting is to review the results of the required reevaluation. So that's a little different than the annual review. It's to determine if the student continues to be eligible for special education and if the student remains eligible to develop a complete IEP. The first reevaluation IEP is held 3 years from the date of the initial IEP. It is then held every 3 years after that. A read must be completed before the IEP meeting. So you have the initial IEP, and then within 365 days you're going to have an annual review, and you're going to do that every year. But in the middle of those times, like every 3 years after the initial, you're going to have to do a reevaluation to determine if the student remains eligible. The annual review is to review the IEP plan that the student's working through, to determine if it's good and if they're making progress. The reevaluation IEP has to be done because if there's any changes and if the student's eligibility changes, you may determine that they no longer need special ed services at this time. So the reevaluation IEP is to determine if the student remains eligible for special education. There can be an IEP meeting for changing placement or adding a service. If you're making a change in the student's placement or an addition of a service that cannot wait until the annual review, you may have to do a whole new IEP possibly. If a new placement is decided on or a service will be added, this may require a new IEP to be developed. So if you're 6 months into the IEP and you decide that the student's kind of not progressing and not doing well and you need to pull them possibly back into special education, you may have to meet to change their placement. Anytime a change of placement is going to be made, you have to do an IEP. If you're just going to change a service, if the student may no longer need speech therapy, you can possibly do an amendment. Usually that's kind of done with an IEP as well. If you're going to terminate a service, it's better if you do an IEP. If you're going to change a goal, revise something, add a goal to their speech therapy, then you can do an amendment. A small change to the IEP is usually done with an amendment. It's minor. You can adjust a goal or you can take away accommodation, like they no longer need to have their tests read. If an amendment is done, it's important that the IEP team is informed of the change so they know what accommodations are needed or if a new goal is being worked on. A change in programming or services requires an IEP meeting. So if you're going to change the placement, move them in or out of special ed, put them in more gen ed, take them out, you have to do an IEP. If you're going to add a service like speech therapy or you're going to take a service away, you need to do a full IEP. A small adjustment, you can do an amendment and you don't have to meet. You could talk to the parent at parent-teacher conferences. If the student is graduating or aging out, you have to have an IEP. The IEP specifies that a special education student services will end when the student graduates from high school or when they age out. And for Michigan, that's when the student's going to turn 26. So you have to do an age out IEP, which requires like a transition plan that would need to then be worked on. If the student's graduating with a diploma, special ed students who are scheduled to graduate from high school with a diploma must have a final IEP meeting. The meeting should be done within 12 months of the anticipated date. So during their junior year, you should be looking to do their graduation kind of IEP. In their junior year, you identify any hurdles that may keep the student from meeting graduation requirements, and for the IEP team to review the student's transition plan to make sure all the services are in place to help them transition out of school. Some people want to call it an exit IEP. You don't really do an exit IEP right before the student leaves. You do their transition plan like kind of in their 11th year to review everything and make sure everything's on track. And you have to do a summary of performance, which is part of the transition, to see how they're going to do moving out after school. The IEP may or may not be able to be completed at the original meeting. The team may need to end the meeting and reconvene, and oftentimes this happens if the team's working on an IEP and there might be a disagreement about what may be the best placement for the student, or a service that the student needs, or a particular goal and objective isn't quite being agreed upon. Sometimes the parents want to visit a site to see if they feel that this is going to work for their child in terms of placement, which they haven't seen before and they're unsure, and they don't want to complete the IEP. The team may not be in agreement about that, or they may need some more time. Sometimes the team's requested to gather more information so that they can make a more informed decision. So you may have to reconvene the IEP. But remember, you have to complete the IEP if this is initial, you have 30 school days to get it done. So hopefully you knew there were going to be any problems before and you took care of that. If it's an annual IEP, remember you have to complete it and offer FAPE within 365 days. So if you think there's going to be any complications to the IEP, you want to meet early enough to take care of any of that. So usually you try to schedule your IEP meetings a couple weeks before the actual date that the last one was done, so that you're within your 365 days if there's any problems. So sometimes you do have to reconvene. Sometimes you can't always complete the IEP at the original meeting. So remember that. A manifestation determination meeting is not a usual meeting that gets done. Special education students, if they've violated the school rules and are being considered for disciplinary action, such as expulsion or suspension beyond 10 school days, you must have something called a manifestation determination. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about discipline in that unit. The focus of the meeting is to decide if the behavior in question has a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability, or was it due to the district's failure to implement the IEP. So that's a special meeting, doesn't happen all the time. Only if there's a disciplinary problem. And part of that meeting is that you have to conduct sometimes a functional behavior assessment and possibly develop a behavior plan as part of the IEP. And if the student already has a behavior plan, the team may need to review that as part of the discipline procedures. And once again, we're going to talk more about functional behavior assessments and behavior plans when we talk about discipline. Sometimes a meeting is requested. Under the IDEA, parents or school staff may request an IEP meeting at any time to discuss some element of the student's IEP. The individual who requests the meeting should be contacted to confirm what the exact request is and if it's within the legal authority of the IEP team to determine that. So you need sometimes get a little more information if a parent's requesting a meeting. Might be something you can take care of just informally. You may not have to call a total IEP meeting. So those are the purposes of having a meeting. So once the purpose is established and you're going to get started, then you're looking at getting into the meeting. So it can be quite challenging. As you see, there's all kinds of different aspects about the IEP process in the meeting. Someone has to lead the team through the legal, procedural, and educational issues that have to be discussed and decided on at the meeting, while at the same time handling any interpersonal issues that occur. The facilitator of the IEP can be an administrator or a school counselor, but in most districts it's the special educator. So you're going to need to be prepared to develop the draft IEP to let the parent hopefully review ahead of time. That makes things a little easier. And at the meeting, go over the draft and work through getting the information into the form, either on paper or using a web-based system. Remember that you cannot bring a completed IEP to the meeting. It has to be a draft meeting because the team has to discuss it. So once you've established the regulations and you've determined the members of the IEP and you've looked at the different purposes and you know the purpose of the meeting, you're going to complete your invitation letter. And once you've got that information, you have to get everybody invited. The invitation serves, remember, as a notice to the parents that you're going to have a meeting, has to tell them the time and the place and the location and the purpose of the meeting and who's going to be invited. The district must make sure that the parent is aware of anybody who's going to attend. You don't have to give necessary specific names, just titles like the general ed teacher or the general ed math teacher or the speech therapist. And it's a really good idea at this point to give a copy of the procedural safeguards that we talked about in the last PowerPoint. This is the time when you can provide them at that annual part. If this is an annual meeting, to the parent, that's the time they get those. If it happens to be an initial IEP, you've probably already given them one when you gave them notice, but it's not a bad idea to give them another copy here. So the invitation letter, you establish the purpose, you set the time and the location in the meeting, and you include a copy of the procedural safeguards to the parents. And it has to be sent in sufficient time for the parents to make arrangements to attend the meeting. Remember, the district has to make the meeting available to the parents. So no specific timeline, but we talked about that 2-week period. Kind of gives them enough time to do that. So once the invitation letter is sent out, or possibly even before that, you have to start being prepared. You have to review the student's file, look at assessment reports, prior and current, create charts or graphs if you need them, consult with other staff, get information from general educators, other service providers that should help you complete the report form or have comments prepared. Review and know the regulations that you have to follow so that you're meeting all of your timelines. And even though you may not be running the meeting, you're going to be the one that writes the draft IEP. So, and remember, you cannot write an IEP before the IEP meeting. You cannot bring something that you say, hey, here's the IEP, this is what we're going to do, just sign it, parents. That is out of compliance. You have to present it as the draft because you're going to review it. What a good process is to write up a draft ahead of time, send it to the parents so that they can look at it and have input into the process, that they can write questions on it, if there's a goal maybe that they'd like to see their student doing, and they can add information and bring that with them to the meeting. It just makes them more of a participant in the process. You should also look at identifying any potential issues like change of placement, lessening or terminating a service, termination of special ed eligibility. Make sure you observe the student in their program so you know how they're doing, and then create an agenda so you know the sequence of the meeting and what has to be addressed. Make sure that if there will be discussion about changing placement or termination, that hopefully there's been some communication with the parent along the way. This should not be something that the district springs on the parent at the IEP meeting. If you think that the student's going to need extra support, like an assistant or an aide, or a computer possibly, or some technology, this should be discussed with your administration or administrators so they don't hear this for the first time at the IEP meeting. The district cannot refuse to provide services if the team feels something's necessary to support the student or allow the student to progress and have educational benefit. However, you need to discuss this as there's usually an extra cost or some kind of extra, getting all the things put into place to get that done. And the district's going to need to look at how they're going to be able to provide that service. Your district administrator will not be very pleased if they hear this information for the first time in the meeting in front of the whole team. Remember, communication with parents and administrators is always the best route. Every meeting needs a facilitator, and the IEP team meeting facilitator in most cases is the special ed teacher, but not always. So in some cases, the school district will designate an administrator or a school counselor. The facilitator should not be necessarily the person recording the information or the changes to the IEP. If you're using a web-based system like Illuminate, there should be someone that's typing and making changes while the facilitator keeps the process moving along. This helps the process move more smoothly. Sometimes the facilitator is also the recorder. It just depends on the situation. So be prepared for that. Also remember that there's a lot of factors that can influence the meeting dynamics. Temperaments, emotional needs, personal styles, communication skills, background, education. Whether you're a facilitator or not, remember that the team is going to be diverse. Some may have no background in cooperation or group decision making, and the team may have a history, good or bad, because there could be conflict between a social worker and a parent, or a parent and a special ed teacher. So each of the members has an agenda when they come in. They have baggage that they bring in. But the work is to keep everybody working for what's best for the student. You keep going back to the data. What are the students' needs and what has been working? You try to focus it on the student. Everyone may have different ideas, but the team is there to do what's best for the student. And so you need to work to cooperate and sometimes, come to an agreement about what's going to work and kind of make the whole team happy. Sometimes everyone can agree and sometimes it doesn't work as smoothly. So the IEP team meeting can end in a number of different ways. The IEP can be completed, the district signed it, but the parent wants to review it. So they take it with them. They kind of hold it hostage. The IEP is completed, the district signs it, but the parent has a proposal. And the IEP is completed, the district signs it, but the parent does not agree. So hopefully the IEP will be uneventful. The IEP will be completed, the district will sign it, they will give the parent notice that this is their offer of FAPE. The parent will go, great, they'll sign off at the meeting, and they'll be good to go. But that's not always the case. Remember, the bottom line is that the IEP is the district's offer of a free, appropriate public education. The parent may or may not always agree, but the district doesn't always have to provide everything that the parent wants. Remember, if the parent proposes something, the district can refuse that as long as they give the parent notice and say, we hear what you're saying. We have considered these things. We think that what we're doing is providing the educational student benefit because here is our data that shows that they're making progress by what we're doing, and so we are not going to do whatever you proposed. Okay? That doesn't mean the parent won't, go off and file a state complaint, but the district has that opportunity to say, we are not going to do that. It's kind of the district's party. So you are offering the parent, this is your offer of a free, appropriate public education. You have to give them notice of that by giving them a copy of the IEP. They can look at it and determine whether they agree or not. If they don't agree, if it's initial IEP, they may not sign for you to implement the IEP. If that's the case, you can't do anything about that. You have completed, the district has completed their child find obligations. They've identified, evaluated, located the student, tried to offer FAPE, the parent has refused. The student would then be returned to general ed, and hopefully you can provide some interventions, but they would not receive services. If it's an annual IEP and the parent just doesn't agree with the IEP, the district can still implement it, even though the parent doesn't agree. So remember that the bottom line is that the IEP is the district's offer of FAPE. The parent may not always agree, but the district does not have to provide everything the parent wants. The IEP has to be developed to provide the student with a free, appropriate public education. Remember that the courts determined that IDEA mandates that school districts provide not the optimal level of services, but rather a basic floor of opportunity and some educational benefit. The team must work to have high expectations for all students, match student skills with educational demands, make decisions based on data, develop an individual program that provides the student with educational benefit, follow procedures and align all of the parts of the IEP, the needs of the student, the present levels, the goals and objectives, accommodations, transition plan, assessments, programs, and services. Try to focus on what the team should be working to do. Remember, while you are in the midst of the IEP season and you are writing 10, 15, 20 IEPs or more, each IEP is for an individual student. Sometimes you can lose track of that. Don't go down the path of creating cookie-cutter plans to try to fit them to all students. Focus on the individual student. Remember, the parents are focused on their child, not all of the students you're working with. Go into each IEP thinking about who you are writing it for. That doesn't mean that some students won't work on the same goals, but it is an individualized education plan, looking at the student's individual needs. If you follow the regulations, keep the individual students in mind, and remember to ask what is the best thing for this student, and keep that as your focal point, it will help you make decisions to develop a plan that will allow the student to progress and achieve educational benefit through a free appropriate public education. If you have any questions about what was presented in this PowerPoint, please contact me, post questions in the virtual office or in the discussion board.